Welcome from Bruno Kreiskys' living room, where we will be talking about Corona, about Europe, about the future, and about the end of the world, if we're lucky. I welcome to Bruno Kreiskys' living room Ivan Krastev. Ivan Krastev, a distinguished political analyst who usually travels the world, advising, observing governments, talking to academics, writing, appearing at conferences. Now, like all of us, he's been slightly less mobile, and what can I say, that immobility resulted in a book. A short and incisive book about the political, strategic, large-scale consequences of the corona crisis. There's one passage that particularly grabbed my attention. Let me quickly read it. It has the wonderful title, "Be Realistic, Demand the Impossible." There are moments when our certainties break down and our collective notion of what is possible changes dramatically. People begin to ignore the present and instead start thinking about the future, whether that's what they hope for or what they fear. It took a virus to turn the world on its head. As I write, the EU has temporarily suspended and citizens took shelter in the security of the nation state. Democracy was put on hold with emergency legislation introduced in most European countries. Parliamentarians have been sent home, demonstrations outlawed, elections postponed, and opposition parties losing political relevance. It was also a world in which capitalism was temporarily suspended, with unemployment skyrocketing and the global economy undergoing a crisis far more devastating than the Great Recession of 2008-09. Indeed, governmental interference in economic markets is greater today than at any time since 1989, and temporary nationalization has become the new normal. Today, we are able to imagine anything because we're being besieged by something that was considered unimaginable. Ivan Krastev, we are in the unimaginable?
It's interesting. We were. And we are in a way, but the interesting story about all these kind of a moments is that normally it is a moment. You have kind of this strangely wonderful focus in which for 2 or 3 weeks you start to think about this is something totally transformative. My previous experience probably is not going to help me to understand what is going on. Everything is possible. And then with the passing of time, people have a very strong tendency to normalize any extreme through which they go. And we know from all these stories of other crises. So I do believe at the moment we are kind of back to a strange sense of normality. But this sense of normality is going to disappear when we're going to see basically the economic phase of the crisis, because now we're just on this kind of a border story in which the first shock after the public health dimensions of the crisis is over, and the economic crisis is still kind of
not yet quite arrived.
Not yet arrived.
I was very interested to read something that you've written, and I've contradicted you in the same paper, when you said that you thought that the crisis would be forgotten very quickly. Because I sort of think it will be the opposite. I think this will set a marker in every future discussion about political order, about economic order, about where societies are going, for one simple reason. Any kind of criticism of the prevailing sort of globalized hyper-capitalism was met with, well, that's all true, that's all very regrettable, but we must maintain growth, we cannot change anything, so go away. This system cannot be changed, this train cannot be stopped. And then it was. And I think that window of experience, of collective experience, is not something that we're going to lose.
It's a very good argument, and to be honest, it's interesting to see who's going to be right. What made me to make this position is very much history. And particularly when all this started, while most of the people have been interested in the medical dimension of the crisis, I started to be interested basically historically how it worked. And I discovered that our minds are designed to remember wars and revolutions, where you have a protagonist, where you have a victory, where you have a project. But nevertheless, that epidemics have been one of the biggest makers of human civilizations. We don't know how to remember them. And this is the favorite illustration of this. I was reading this beautiful book of Laura Spini on the Spanish flu. And she was making an argument which is, in my view, very valid. She said, listen, probably 2 or 3 times more people died as a result of the Spanish flu. The Spanish flu was much more global than the World War I.
But it had one important difference.
It was
entirely in the shadow of the war, a larger catastrophe.
So here's the story. We don't know what is going to be the next catastrophe.
But may I continue this argument? There's at least one reading where you can say Corona is actually part of the environmental collapse that we're witnessing. It was part of an extreme expansion into a biosphere where human invention was new. These animals would have never met apart from on a wet market, so the virus really made the jump to a human host because of this extreme emphasis on growth and globalization.
No, listen, I totally agree with you. Something very important, and from this point of view, Corona is very similar.
But it's also part of a chain of events.
No, agree totally. Because normally before, and it started with the 17th century, basically started with the Enlightenment philosophy, where you make a distinction between human-produced disasters, like wars, and kind of a natural disasters, like earthquakes. And as you know, the basic debate about the Lisbon earthquake. So when people stopped to believe that this is simply God punishing us for something, there was a major distinction.
But this is really interesting, because the Lisbon earthquake, just to bring our viewers up to speed, 1755, All Saints' Day, 1st of November, half of Lisbon is in church praying, and an earthquake hits the city, kills up to 30,000 people. A tsunami also is part of that. And there was, of course, at the moment a huge debate in Europe about the Enlightenment, and therefore also about the space of God in the world.
Yeah.
And as the Enlightenment had reimagined God, God was not only good and just and omniscient, but he was also rational. And so there was an obvious cognitive dissonance between a rational good God and something so irrational happening, and this really created a big debate in the 18th century. Now the question is, isn't what we've just witnessed our Lisbon earthquake? Because it creates the same kind of cognitive dissonance. We've got this project of never-ending growth, and then a stupid little virus comes and makes it all evaporate.
Totally agree. And this is the story. My major argument was what is common between the climate change crisis and this crisis is that you cannot distinguish anymore between the natural causes and the human causes. In a certain way, they went together. So we basically ended the process that started with Lisbon earthquake. But what is also interesting, and I do believe Laura Spini is making this argument, the biggest problem of remembering this type of epidemics is that people are shocked by the arbitrariness of death. There is not a story to tell. A lot of people are dying. By the way, if you go back to the chronicles, you're going to see that one of the most depressing things about all these epidemics was not simply that people are dying, but people are dying without funeral. Because people are afraid that going to a funeral, you're going to be infected. We saw part of it in Italy these days. But the most interesting is it's arbitrary death. There is no meaning. In the war, there is a narrative which is telling you that you don't simply died. You sacrificed your life for something. And now this narrative is not there. And the arbitrariness of death is making people basically totally shocked, and this makes this kind of pandemics so kind of shattering events. The second thing, and it goes very much in your direction, but it's not about being remembered, but being transformative. We're living in the world in which we are doomed to overreact to everything happening. One of the story that is going to come, listen, I was in Bulgaria during the pandemic. For the moment in Bulgaria, there are less than 3,000 people infected and less than 200 people who died. So now, if nothing is going to happen and something can happen, the second wave can easily come, but people are going to say, what was all this about? But we're living in a world in which we're so much interdependent, because it's not simply about basically growth, it's about interdependency. And the major story of globalization is the more interdependent we are economically, the more secure we are. The more you're trading with each other, the less we fight with each other. And suddenly you discover interdependency, a source of total insecurity. It is insecure because basically something happening in a market somewhere in China is going to affect the life of somebody in Vienna or in Sofia. Secondly, because you don't know what to do. And I was very much interested in this overreaction because this is on everything. There was a nuclear power station, goes with an accident in Japan, and Germany is closing their nuclear industry. It could be good or bad, I'm not commenting on this. But now we are in a world in which we recognize that we are so much not in control, that you are living not with what is happening, but with what could happen. And
but what really interests me is that it sort of reverses also how we think about human beings. Human beings as basically, I mean, the classic Enlightenment views as sovereign, free, rational, free agents in a world they are there to subdue. And us in a post-corona world, very fragile, very porous to the outside, certainly not rational if you look how people are reacting. This is changing things, very profound things about how we see ourselves.
No, also we rediscovered our mortality. One of the interesting stories, you have, at least in the beginning, you have a virus about which we don't know many things, but you know that it's particularly vulnerable. The senior people, basically people who are older than 80s and so on. Normally, you should say, it's fine, at least the kids are saved. But for us, in a certain way, it was even more traumatic. Because we are living in a world in which kind of we have turned our back to death.
Do you think it would be more traumatic? Do you think it wouldn't be, I mean, if this virus mainly affected kids, I think our societies would be in a much worse state.
No, I do believe, but the strange story about old people dying, and there was all this now studies saying that most of the people, for example, who died in Hamburg, they should have died anyway in 6 months. People don't understand that in a certain way this was part of the bigger problem. And the bigger problem is that for us, the death is not natural anymore. So nevertheless, how old a person is, when he dies, we ask, was it a doctor's mistake? Mm-hmm. Why it happened? And this is part of our understanding of humanity. I find something extremely, I feel very proud of those doctors who are fighting even for the life of people that they expect can live only 6 months more or 8 months more. So from this point of view, this is about what our civilization is. Mm-hmm. And there was a famous Italian scientist in the natural science who said something that I found very moving. He said, listen, it's not a battle between life and death, because at the end of the day we're always dying. So it's not Rovelli. So in a certain way, the death is always winning. But we are trying to save even months or year and so on.
But also, that said, a strange thing, and I thought a strangely positive thing about our societies.
Absolutely.
Because in the grip of the great market narrative, when push came to shove, we chose to protect people who are not economically productive and to cost the state money. And there would have been a perfectly social Darwinist argument to be made, as indeed Boris Johnson did at the beginning, for instance, to say, well, this is just nature taking its course. And we decided, no, as societies, we don't want to be societies like that. We'd rather suspend the mechanisms of the market and concentrate on keeping that alive, quite literally.
Totally.
That was quite a remarkable moment.
The equality of patients is something extremely interesting. There was a talks, and by the way, it appeared, I didn't know that there was a kind of ethics manual. What is happening, for example, do you remember when ventilators was the key word? After that, it turned out that from a medical point of view, it was slightly illusionary. But what you're doing when you have one ventilator and 3 or 4 different patients, when you can basically decide whom to save. And it was interesting to see, these ethical manuals that in a certain way, part of it, the heart of our civilization is that our equality of life is not based on neither how old we are, nor how sick we are. pre-existing conditions. Listen, in real life, we know that people with the pre-existing conditions, the poor people, the minorities, the coward people, have been dying. But it's different.
But that's my point, because that's also and then that's a second phenomenon that this virus has shown. This virus has been really, no great business consultancy would have been more efficient at pointing out the weaknesses in a system, as this virus has been, frankly expressed in death rates, and as you say, people from ethnic minorities. And at the beginning there was an argument that this may be a genetic factor, but it turned out that it was entirely socioeconomic. The kind of jobs people were working, the kind of living conditions people were living in, access to education in homeschooling when there are no parents to homeschool you, etc. So there were, in many ways, it pointed to the empirical weaknesses in our societies and really pinpointed them. How do you think that our societies can react to that?
And from this point of view, this is interesting, because normally people said how much the pandemic changed the life. But Saramago, in his novel Blindness, which I like a lot, and telling the story of pandemic as the loss of freedom, he made a point which I found very profound. He said it's not so much how it changes it, but how it allows us to see how it has changed anyway. To what extent we are living in a world that was not the world in which basically we actually live. And from this point of view, you start, even when you go with the idea stay home, there is a major assumption that everybody has homes. The very idea of stay at home and
that you're safer at home.
First, that you're safer.
Second, you're safer at home in a middle
first of all,
class.
the idea that you have home is something that basically is a very strong kind of assumptions for probably 80% of the population. But for 20% of the population, basically, the very existence of home is problematic. Secondly, that it is safe. Certainly that you can stay there for enough time, for a longer time. And I do believe suddenly in a certain societies, and this is why America was kind of so shattered, all these assumptions you start to check. And when you're living with the 6 persons in the same room, being undocumented migrant, the idea that you're going home because you're keeping a social distance, of course, is a joke. You're not keeping any social distance. And then if you're paid by week working in the service industry, the idea that you can stay home for more than 2 or 3 days is also not an option. And these things everybody in a way knows, but then comes this distinction between essential and non-essential jobs. And this is basically people that can work from home and those that cannot work from home. And this was interesting to see what the non-essential jobs. By the way, the most interesting is the parliament. The government turned to be essential job for sure, but the parliament was sent home. And I do believe all these divides became so obvious and people are seeing them. And the other paradox, which for me was very much central, is that obviously it's a crisis of globalization. It's a global market, as basically the dark side of interconnectedness, the dark side also of mobility. It's not by accident that the places that were hurt most were the hubs like New York, like London, and so on. At the same time, as I told you, I was spending in a very depopulated part of Bulgaria. And then I saw this also crisis as the agent of globalization. Because people who are not interested in the world suddenly go home and start watching television and start knowing and being interested in other places, because suddenly for 2 months we have been living in a common world. And the name of this world was COVID-19. You are interested how many people have been infected and dying in US, in and Mexico, why? Yes. And why. You start to compare all the time, because for the first time everything looked comparable. And this is the illusion for sure, of course, but you have this, and suddenly people became cosmopolitans at the very moment when they cannot move, when they're doing kind of nothing. And I found this kind of one of these big ironies, and this is why, at least in my mind, this crisis and this pandemics was extremely important with the paradoxes that I see, then with the lessons or trends and so on, because what is interesting, it could be as transformative as 1989, but in 1989 we have the illusion that we know in which direction the world is going. Now no such an illusion. You have the feeling that everything goes at the same time in all directions.
At the same time, in those 7 paradoxes that you talk about in the book, the crisis seems to be almost a sort of combustion agent or catalyst. It seems to quicken all the developments that you talk about, be it renationalization, globalization, also this the future of the European Union. You think that it's really the inflammatory agent that makes these things develop?
Yeah, my feeling is this is kind of, I didn't see it as a disruptor, I see it as an amplifier. Many of the trends have been there before. And suddenly they have been totally intensified. And if there was something that was really kind of shaking about the crisis, at least for the moment, it was not simply the scale, which was incredible, basically. 2 billion people were sent home overnight. Planes were landed overnight. Borders were resurrected overnight. But it was the fact that if we had been having this conversation 1 year ago, and we're talking about globalization, we can have talked about climate change or anything, and you're going to ask the question, what kind of crisis can give chance to international cooperation? Give me of all possible crises, wars, migration. What is the type of the crisis that can basically force people and governments to act together? I was going to tell you pandemic.
Now, one of the paradoxes that you mentioned is the trust in science and the trust in governments. Exactly what you've just outlined. And there is an interesting fact here that in the first instance, this virus was very bad news for populists and for incompetent, cocky, chauvinist government, because you could simply count the results and death rates. Where people said this virus is all Chinese propaganda and I don't believe in it, we won't do anything, 10 times more people died. Now, this has the charm of an immediate situation where you can see immediate outcomes and where you can really compare, as people were. Now, with beginning reconstruction efforts, assuming that not a second wave is going to throw this whole thing back, politics will start again. And with that, the easy measurability of comparison will be much diluted.
Totally. And also, to be honest, now we did some survey, European Council of Foreign Relations in all countries, and it appeared that it was illusion, also my personal illusion, that the trust in expertise have been restored as a result of this crisis. The survey was done now just at the moment when the country started to get out. So even we're not going to this much more dramatic economic part of the story that you're asking for. And it appeared that, in fact, Europe, at least these 9 countries, which represent two-thirds of the European Union population, are divided on 3 groups, almost equally big. One of those who basically don't trust the expertise in science, and the major reason is that scientists disagree between each other. And of course, science is about scientists disagreeing. But in this moment,
public understanding of science is often very low.
Totally. And people said no. And of course, the most dramatic place was France. Because you have 2 absolutely famous, legendary scientists, one of them Nobel Prize winner, the other kind of a big star. And they were on a totally opposite direction of what to do. So people said, if the scientists cannot find a common ground, not about details, when they disagree about basics, science cannot be trusted as a policy player. Then comes the people who basically said science could be trusted, exactly what you said. Those who were doing what the experts said did better than those who pretended nothing is happening. But the third group is extremely interesting. They said, okay, in general, probably the science can be trusted, but what cannot be trusted is the governments make their policies on expertise. In fact, the governments are just using experts to justify decisions that have been already taken. So at least my assumption was that when you have this medical expert staying next to the prime minister, part of the power of the expert will go to the government. Now it appeared that you trust the expert to the extent you trust the government.
Yes.
And this
in Britain it was also witnessed because when the epidemiologist wanted to say something, the Prime Minister told him to be quiet.
And the US was exactly the same. So from this point of view, this is the story. And also what struck me in this talk about expertise, as I told you, I do believe that this kind of intuition that I had in the beginning turned to be wrong, is now we all asked when is the end of the crisis, we're going to say this is the vaccine. and everybody is invested. And with the 50% of the Americans saying that they're never going to vaccinate themselves, and by the way, also high percent of Germans and Austrians, what exactly we're talking about?
But not only that, because this is really interesting. I'd like to come back to the US in a moment, and I've been thinking about you a lot apropos of that, and I've quoted you.
Yeah.
Because you once produced this beautifully counterintuitive sentence for Western Europeans. Western Europeans, we believe in the rationality of power, you don't. And you said, what's this that people always believe that every problem has a solution? As if you just put the right number on the right of the equal sign. Some problems don't have solutions, some problems can only be survived.
Yeah.
End of your quote.
Yeah.
Now it seems to me that Corona is a problem without a solution. First of all, if there is a virus, and after 30 years and enormous funds, there's still nothing against AIDS. If there is a vaccine, other Corona vaccines last for a few months. They are not permanently effective. We have now just heard that the vaccines that are being developed may not work for old people.
Yeah.
So basically, there is no one-stop solution for this problem where you can say one shot and now the world is how it used to be again. But this is something we can only live along with. We can only find an intelligent arrangement with. And I don't want to overdo this parallel, but it does seem to me that with climate change, it's in many ways the same.
Absolutely.
And this little thing really forces us to develop this way of thinking. This is not something we can
very
solve.
much agree with you. And this is the most important is what we mean basically by solution in general. Solution is much more now becoming a psychological device. Solution is the feeling that we're back in control of something, where we're obviously not. So what vaccine is going to allow? Vaccine is going not to change so much the situation on the ground, it's going to change the conversation. And how you live with the problems, from this point of view, pandemic was incredible, and this was so disheartening that there was not international response, because compared with the climate change, pandemic has two major advantages to push international community to act together. First, the urgency. Well, with the climate change, this is going to be much more destructive in the long run because there is no way back, but it's going to be different for different parts of the world. You always can hope that you're not going to save the earth, but you're going to save your part, your corner of the earth. And nevertheless, that it sounds totally irrational, many people believe it. Many people believe it that we cannot save the earth as a whole, so the problem is, can we save ourselves? With pandemic, you had the feeling that now people can do it. They're not doing it. Even more, I was talking to some people who are now following much closer what is happening on this kind of a fight for vaccine, and this is becoming like the Cold War. The Soviet-American space competition is now totally replaced by the American-Chinese vaccine competition. It's not so much that you believe that if you're going to have a vaccine, particularly if your people don't want to be vaccinated, you're going to see the problem, but this is the symbolic victory. This is like man on the moon. Mm-hmm. We want to show our power. I do believe this, I very much agree with you, how to live with the problems that are not going to be solved. All these years I was seeing on the airports Asians with facial masks. And for me they have been like an aliens. I said, where do these people come from? Now if you see the research, it shows that one of the major factors that explains why Chinese, South Koreans, Taiwanese, by the way, very different political regimes, were relatively successful to contain the spread of the disease was their previous experience with SARS. Better than others, they have lived not how to solve the problem, but how to control, how to live with this, how to diminish this, how to negotiate with the problem. Mm-hmm. So, in a way, people before have been negotiating with God. And of course, the God have been the absent negotiator, so you're negotiating, but he's not responding. I do believe now we went in the similar situation with Earth and with the problems that we are facing.
Let's turn to something a little more concrete, something that's really more on the focus of your analysis, and that is the particular consequences on this, basically on Europe. Your purview is global, but you choose to concentrate on Europe for this analysis. And let's just take as an example, the European Union, which we all felt, and I've just read you part of this chapter, had been suspended during the crisis, collapsed during the crisis, appeared to be a sort of, a club just operating in beautiful weather, because it appeared not only that the countries closed down and exposed Europe as a fiction, but it also appeared that there seemed to be no European strategy, European institution that could coordinate this, that could give also a coherent message. It was also a problem of messaging. Then, in the conversations about reconstruction, about the Corona bonds, and so there was some amount of European thinking again, and these are still ongoing, and they may indeed transform the European Union. But where do you think is the balance of advantage here?
This is extremely interesting, because in a certain way, if you see this crisis, you can treat it as the second coming of the three previous crises that we saw in the last 10 years. For example, the moment when overnight states closed their borders, and we should be very fair about this, all European states, those that always try to be very European-minded like Germany, and those like Hungary at the same time. And there was no any difference in the first 10 days between the behavior of Germany and Hungary. The idea was, I'm responsible for my own people, this is my major priorities, this is what I can take in care. So this was, so you said, okay, we're back to this kind of instinct, and people obviously has the instinct that in moment of crisis, in the way you go home back to the nation state.
You draw a drawbridge and
to nation state. By the way, this was also traditional way states have been fighting epidemics. From 17th century, in Habsburg Empire, basically one of the major spying activity of the Habsburg state was to figure out, is there an epidemics in the Ottoman Empire, and to close the borders. The second thing was the economic crisis, and now when you see all this talk about Corona bonds and so on, you have the feeling that we're back to 2008, 2009. And thirdly, if you remember people like Agamben and others, when they started talking about the state of emergency, restriction of rights, the anti-democracy, many people believe that basically this Corona crisis is the second coming of the war on terror, where basically you have these restrictions. My major argument was that it's very different. In all these three cases, it looks like it, but this is not like this. For example, on the national issue and closing of the borders, on one level we closed the border in order to realize a month later that we cannot keep them closed. So it was the national instinct, but also it exposed the limits, particularly of economic nationalism. At the moment when people were not allowed to leave their apartments, there was a charter flights for Bulgarians and Romanians to come to Austria and Germany in order basically to do the harvest.
Big strawberries and asparagus.
So this was kind of... Secondly, this type of nationalism was very different than the one provoked by the refugee crisis. Refugee crisis was a classical ethnic nationalism. It was about origin. It was about language. It was about where, in which culture you are. Here, it was about territory. For example, even in East European countries, not famous kind of for huge tolerance during the refugee crisis, foreigners have been treated very carefully. I mean, any type of people that happen to be there, because your health depended on everybody following the same rules. Social distancing, you cannot just do it for your own, because if others are not doing this, you're doomed. While at the same time, Bulgarians who decided not to go back to the country in the time of quarantine, the government said, listen, it's your decision. Let the place in which you are take care of you. So the ethnic principle, which was so important in 2015, was totally replaced by this resident, stay-at-home type of nationalism. On economic issues, and this is, I found, a major transformative issue happening in Europe. Germany was the major guardian of the status quo in 2008, 29, 2010. Fiscal discipline, conditionality, basically keep it in the way it is. And suddenly after this crisis, both domestically, but on the European level, Germany became the transformative power. understanding that for the first time, and this is interesting, this is not a federalist moment. To be honest, I don't buy the story that we are in a Hamiltonian moment, because people became much more national state and national interest minded than before. But suddenly the nationalists realized that in this world in which Europe is so isolated, with China much more aggressive, with the US absent and broken, only the consolidation on continental level, only the consolidation of the EU is giving you any chance of relevance.
When you say people, which people do you mean?
No, I mean people. I mean, because after the book was over, and the book was unfortunately finished on April 30th, so it was long ago. Together with the colleagues from ECFR, we did this polling, which was very much on these questions, in 9 EU member states, and this was the people. I mean, I'm not going to use the word public opinion because it's very pretentious, but there is public mood. And for example, people, there is no country in which people believe that the EU did a good job. There are countries where people were quite satisfied with what their governments did. Germany was like this, Denmark, we were not doing Austria. Sweden was like this, probably it's going to change now, but when we have been polling, Sweden was like this. And there are countries like Italy, Spain, France, where the public mood was totally different. But the interesting story is...
But does that reflect the trust in institutions?
Totally.
Generally?
Totally. It reflects the trust. It also reflects the judgment of the people, how the government did it. In Germany, after this crisis, majority of Germans get much more self-confident about what their state can do. Capacity, we can do it. And obviously, the Chancellor found the language to which to tell the people, it's not that we're not going to have a problem, but we know what we're doing. In Italy, there was a certain support for the government coming out of the extremeness of the situation, but there was no self-confidence in the very capacity of the state. So it was not simply about this government or that government. By the way, this crisis for this moment has not changed the voting preferences of people if you're not looking to your parties, but between mainstream parties and populists. Populist voters are moving from one party to another, mainstream voters to one to another. But the major dividing line was not basically changed. What has changed is how Europeans saw the world. 1/3 of the Europeans get much more mistrustful toward China. And this was not about simply that we're blaming Chinese that it started there. I don't believe it's so simple. Simply they saw that China tried to use its position to get the political points.
And also was quite obviously not entirely truthful about
exactly.
the
They
numbers
were
of
lying.
the victims.
But also you see the power face of China, pushing others to praise them. And then the United States, basically the view of the United States, unfortunately, absolutely collapsed in some countries. And part of it, of course, is President Trump. Part of it is not Trump. Part of it is just what you see on the television. Listen, you have this extremely rich country, powerful country, 70% of its GDP goes for health. And then you see exactly what we have been talking. All the problems of the American society suddenly is in front of your eyes, and you are not asking anymore why Trump is doing this and that. The question is the US be able to do this type of a global leadership, or should they focus on themselves?
At this point, I mean, we're talking about Europe, but I can't sort of resist. You were talking about populism and Corona. Now, in the United States, this effect has been so pronounced, and it's an interesting case study. I mean, this is the thing, I think, for people like you and me at the moment. I always feel, for a historian, there's no better time to be alive.
Absolutely.
Because you see a paradigm change. Totally. You see one thing end and another one begin, and we don't know that yet, and it's fascinating to watch. Living in this period is slightly more difficult and slightly more scary. But let's just stay with the fascination. You described the effect of Corona on populism, and it will very much depend, in fact our future will very much depend on how these narratives are spun over the next decades. Short-term case study, November 2020. Donald Trump stands for election. Let's assume the American economy has recovered to some degree. Has this helped him or broken him?
This is, first of all, of course, the only thing there are only two factors that can help him, and one is recovery of the economy, spectacular recovery of the economy. Not simply going back on the level of economic growth, but job recovery. Because then he can say, I did it. And the second is kind of a major extreme politics, violence on the streets, where he can play the law and order. But something important has changed as a result of COVID-19 when it comes to the electoral chances of Trump. I was reading some data from the US today. What has changed is the view of the people older than 65. This was a very important group for Donald Trump. He totally destroyed Hillary Clinton in this group. This is predominantly white group. This is basically also more conservative people. And then now after COVID-19, the majority of people over 65, 54% of them declared that they're going to vote for Joe Biden. What has changed is that at some point he said something that we discussed before. Economy is more important than the life, than you. And people never forgive him. These people are not voting for him or against him on the basis, in my view, of other policy decisions. They probably even didn't like him much before. This is also not a generation that is particularly moved by the Black Lives Matters, which is very much a generational issue for the younger generation. But these people had the feeling that for him the economy was more important for their lives. And I do believe this is going to make the re-elections of Trump much more difficult. 6 months ago, I do believe his chances to be re-elected were really great. Now he should change the view of these people. And paradoxically, these people are not thinking only in economic terms.
What could change their view?
Listen, one of the stories that for the moment we have politics in the United States with one candidate, and this is Trump. Joe Biden is totally invisible.
I don't understand why. I don't understand why he doesn't.
I do believe that in a certain way his advisors were right, because one of the reasons these old people identify with Biden is because he's invisible. Because you have two old people, honestly speaking. You have Donald Trump and Joe Biden, all of them kind of not teenagers. One of them jumping, at least is behaving like one. Yeah, but one is behaving like an old person. He's staying home. He's being afraid of what's going to happen. So this is why more than kind of political things that you have the feeling that he understands you. Because he understands that for somebody who is older than 70, this crisis is totally different than somebody who is at 17 or 27. But of course, Joe Biden is not the strongest candidate that you can imagine, and he has a huge problem exactly to connect with this younger generation that you can see on the streets. And what could happen, and this is kind of there are two nightmare scenarios for the US in general, nevertheless where you stand politically. I do believe one is basically you have people who are on the streets who protest but then don't vote. And this is the tragedy for the Democratic Party, and we have seen this in many places. Because even now on the opinion polls, 80% of those who declare that they're going to vote for Trump, they said that they excited voting for Trump. Only 54% of those who declare that they're going to vote for Joe Biden said that they're excited to vote for Joe Biden. It's
not very easy to be excited
about Joe Biden. From a certain point of view, they're ready to vote against Trump, but there is not identity. Totally opposite to what was the case, particularly in 2008 when Obama was running. But the second, and this is a really nightmare scenario, is contested elections. Elections in which, because of a small margin of victory, if this is going to be the case, the loser, particularly if this is President Trump, said this was unfair elections, there was irregularity.
Isn't that almost a likely scenario?
And this is an interesting story. This is a likely scenario, but this is also certain things that I have seen in other elections in other parts of the world. There is a kind of an instinct in the population, and in moments like this, when people then make their mind, they go in one direction or the other in a landslide. You don't know in which direction, but in a certain way, people don't want this to happen. This, so I'll not be surprised if we're going to see a landslide, not because of the data, but because of this feeling that we are not going to allow contested elections. I have seen this, for example, in places like Albania, or places not like, but there is something in the instinct of the voters that it's up to us. We cannot leave it kind of in the way to be decided, be it by the Supreme Court or by this or that. So, but it's interesting. I do believe it's going to be amazing, but nevertheless what's going to happen, and I do believe, talking back to Europe, for the Europeans, America is a different world. It could be very hopeful in the long term, but you know that in the next 5 or 10 years, America is going to be about America. It is such a broken place. And at the same time, basically, if before, for us, China was about China, you start to understand that China is about the world. And we are so much afraid that we can become a traffic victim of the chicken game between the United States and China, that this creates a strange positioning with respect to the European Union, which has nothing to do with the divides of the previous crisis. This crisis did not divide people on pro-Europeans and nationalists.
But that brings us to your quite stark choice that you say there are really only 2 ways to go for Europe now, or for the European Union. It can develop in the direction of a United States of Europe that is going to have a strong presence internationally, and that is what holds it together, really, not our sort of warm, fuzzy feeling about all having the same identity, but a rather more robust feeling of us sharing strategic interests, which are certainly also very necessary. And on the other hand, disintegration.
Which can take a form not of exiting, and this very because
you say like the Habsburg, like the Holy Roman Empire. It sort of exists in name, but
it exists in name, but nobody
notice.
really cares, because the story, and you're going to see it in the short term. Listen, in the next 6 months, either the German presidency are going to make it, which means that there's going to be a budget, and this budget is going to create a transfer. And when I talk, and we're talking about empowering the European center, Brussels, on things like, for example, digital tax or carbon tax and so on. But this is very different than kind of the dream for the United States of Europe. I don't see this dream in part of the populations. Paradoxically, we're going to see, probably, if it works, the biggest de facto federalization of Europe in the total absence of a federalist sentiment. Something has happened, I don't know why, but people basically lost this emotional kind of devotion to this federalist idea. But what is happening, and this is also interesting, what keeps now Europe, before Europe was very much kept together by the feeling that we're the model of the world to come. We're post-sovereign, we're post-national. Paradoxically, we didn't think much about the future because we were the future. Also in structural terms. And suddenly...
I remember a book by Mark Leonard,
yeah,
How Europe Will Run the 21st Century.
And this was a very strong sentiment, saying we are not the most powerful. We never had this illusion. But at the end of the day, we're the laboratory for the future. World is moving in our direction. And now we don't see this happening. And it's not about authoritarianism, democracy. India, Brazil, how you're going to define them, they're becoming much more sovereignist even than they have been. But suddenly, people realize, okay, imagine that this kind of a liberal order is going to dismantle. What for Europe? And then comes, in my view, this important story. If everybody goes protectionist, on what level Europeans can be protectionist? Can Austria be protectionist in economic terms? What does it exactly mean? And then comes the idea, which I found also reading this data of the polls, there is a strangely emerging the idea of progressive protectionism. So the story is the following. Okay, we cannot impose on others our values, our way of life. They are too strong, too big, too numerous. But if we want to have any influence in the world, simply pretending and defending ourselves is taxing others for doing things in a way we do believe is harmful. For example, okay, we cannot tell the Chinese how to transform the economy.
Carbon tax.
Yeah, and then EU is going to come with a carbon tax and saying, listen, we know that we cannot do it on our own. If we decarbonize totally, the world is not going to be saved, the earth is not going to be saved. But the way to influence others is saying, but if you want to make business with us, you should follow these rules. And this goes also with a big technology company, the digital. Okay, we don't have the technological giants like the Chinese and the Americans, but if you basically want to act on this market, so for a certain time we understood that the only thing on which Europe is big is the consumer market. So we don't have the military power neither of Americans, nor Chinese, nor the Russians. We don't have basically the demographic power of other countries, places like Africa and others where you have a lot of young people and they're going to do things and so on. But still, there are many people who believe that the economy depends on what we're buying, what we're doing.
I would actually identify another area where Europe has an international role to play, a global role to play, that seems insignificant at the moment, but in the next 2 decades, I think, will unfortunately become very important, and that's environmental technologies and expertise. And there Europe could become a world leader, and these are problems that are going to affect other countries much more, so Europe could really make itself that kind of model for a future, for a global future.
Totally agree with you, and to be honest,
I don't think the Europeans will have the vision and the courage to do that, but it will be possible.
No, it's possible, and to be honest, I do believe this is where van der Leyen is. Because when people asking question how it happened, the classical center-right politician who talks about her commission, a geopolitical commission, is so much focused on the environmental issues and green issues. And for her, green is the new geopolitics. First, we need to come with the technologies which, if we're going to develop now, this is what we can export outside and we can be model. But secondly, and this is very important, if you want to put taxes on others, you're going to do it on the name of the public good, not of European good. We're saying, listen, we're not going to tolerate you destroying basically our common earth, or this and that. And this combination between producing technologies and showing that we are sacrificing also our certain type of short-term economic competitiveness and so on for a better world allows you, and this is why I was calling this progressive protectionism, that you are not going with this type of protectionism which is trying to keep the things in the way they are, but it is a different way to try to transform the world from the position of monopoly lost after many things. How successful it's going to be is a question. Europe is much more fragmented. The cost of this is going to be very high, particularly when you're going to end up with a lot of unemployed people. But I'm going to give you one example to show that it's not simply a talk. If you compare the money that the German government decided to give as an incentives to the auto industry in 2009 and 10 and now, you're going to see totally different approach. Before, the idea was get the money and continue doing what you're doing. Now all the money goes to the incentives for people who are going to buy electric cars.
Which are already actually quite an old technology, and it's probably not the way to go.
From the point of view of those who are producing cars, it's a game changer. Because in a certain way the message is, I'm not going to support what you're doing now. And for government, because this is a very dramatic intervention, saying, listen, I don't want, and this is the difference in my view, in the logic of fighting for the life of a person and fighting for the life of economy. Fighting for the life of the person, as we talked, you should not distinguish between the 8-year-old and the 8-year-old, and this is our civilization. Fighting for the life of economy, you should not try to save company which otherwise is going to bankrupt in 6 months or 6 years.
A bit of Darwinism in the economy is acceptable.
Even more. Basically, you should amplify and you should say, better basically bankrupt now and try to see what you're going to do next. Then I'm going to give you money for the next 6 months, and then basically you're going to come back and we're going to have the same problem. And of course, it's easy to be said than to be done, particularly if you're government and particularly people who are running these companies are going to vote. But I do believe this is the major chance, and this is what's going, in my view, to keep Europe very much intense, because people always try, you know, I have this in the book and it probably is stupid, but Shklovsky has the definition of art, and he said, what is art? The major story about art, he said, is to make the familiar unfamiliar. I'm talking about this coach. And you know it, and you have been always knowing it, but then I'm going to either make it in an exhibition. You know it so well you don't see it anymore. Yeah, on exhibition, or I'm going to write a poem about it, and the familiar, you're going to see it totally differently. Politics works the other way around. It makes unfamiliar looks familiar. Comes something that basically we have never seen before, but we're taking control of it, pretending That this is very much like something that we have been solving before, and the whole idea of self-confidence is that in a certain way there is nothing new. And I do believe now the biggest problem is that the politicians should be slightly like artists, pushing us to see familiar is unfamiliar, then basically simply
the last artist who became a major politician isn't really a great recommendation. But
yeah, probably the risk of the profession. It also
no, but I mean that is the question of the Lisbon earthquake, that you feel that a way of seeing the world collides with reality and breaks because reality is simply quite different.
But also don't forget, imagine the people who went, all of us, through all this. And you have two different reactions of two different groups. One is you have different activists. And for these people, for example, if you're a climate change activist, you have been dreaming for the last 5 years, 10 years, that all planes should be landed. Now, you were dreaming about this, but you believed that this is impossible. And it happened. Overnight. Or you're radical nationalists, and you have been dreaming that overnight all the borders between the EU member states are going to be resurrected. You have been dreaming about this, but you knew that this is impossible. And it happened.
But but this brings us back to an earlier point, but isn't that what makes this moment so important? That not distinguishing between who you find particularly nice or sympathetic, it has resurrected dreams. It has shown people that societies actually have a choice.
This is one group, and by the way, this is the groups that you're going to see now fighting the radicalized on the level of political imagination. But then you're going to have majorities, and this is something interesting is happening. For these people, the pre-COVID-19 world, for many of them, was not normal. They were unhappy with it, they said it's not normal. Now for them, this is normality. The idea to go back to normality, to fly as we have been flying, to be ready to plan our life in the way it is, the very success is defined as going back where we were. And both of these trends are there, because after every kind of major epidemics comes the epidemics of nostalgia. You are basically infected with the longing to be back to something that you have lost. And the thing that you have lost probably is not something that you have valued very much back then, but suddenly now. So on one level you have the radicals, on the other you have the nostalgics. And both are very much strengthened by this crisis. And this is what I do believe is going to be most interesting. And to be honest, being a politician, it's not easy to deal with a society that is shaped by these two groups. Because in order to calm down, once you should say, okay, listen, look Vienna, it is as if there was no COVID-19. And then to talk to the others, you should say, look at Vienna, it's totally different than you remember pre-COVID-19.
You make a strong case for this being a watershed moment. And I'm wondering, one epidemic that we haven't yet talked about, the Black Death in the middle of the 14th century, really changed Europe very radically. First of all, it eradicated in some areas half of the population, but it changed the social balance. It made the work of the little people more expensive. It gave them a stronger bargaining position, changed the social composition of society, etc., etc. But it also did one very important thing, which is expressed in a whole genre of art that comes out of this epidemic, and that is the danse macabre, the dance of death, where death, exemplified by a skeleton, and you always have a sort of series of images, and you see that he carries people to the grave or dances with them to the grave, pulls them in it, and everyone, from the prostitute and the beggar to the king and the pope, everyone is equal in the face of death. Now that is something that sounds slightly more familiar now with COVID, although we said this equality is actually quite deceptive. Do you think there will be one kind of enduring image that will take root in our societies after this crisis, one particular sentiment that is sort of common resonance space for people to refer to?
I don't know. First, the biggest problem of this conversation is that we don't know when this is going to end and how this is going to end. Because the Black Death basically destroyed half of European population. What we got was something, and this is why I do believe we started seeing things that were there before, but we didn't see them before. There was this famous psychological experiment, very well known. So you're taking a person and you start showing him in a very quick procession drawings of cats and asking him what does he see. And he's telling you he's seeing cats. And then among the cats he starts putting drawings of dogs. But you continue asking him what does he see. And the person said cats. And then somebody shouting his name. So he's distracted for a moment. And when he's back to the drawings, for the first time he starts seeing the dogs. I do believe that this 2 months experience was like this. Suddenly we stopped, and this is true for all of us. You have our everyday life, and you have a certain rhythm, and the rhythm was disrupted. And I don't believe that the world was so much disrupted at this moment yet. And then you start seeing things, relations with people, relations with parents, relations with kids. You start, for example, I was 69 days in the Bulgarian countryside, and for these 69 days I had 14 plane tickets cancelled. And the moment they cancelled, you understand that before you had all these good justifications why you cannot cancel almost any of them. You have promised here, this is important here, you're going to make money here. And then suddenly they were cancelled and nothing. And I do believe this is changing on the level of the individual life.
Yes.
Or you decided to do this and that, you cannot plan anything. And suddenly you said, okay, probably I don't need to do it. It's not that I should know exactly where I'm going to be in 6 months or 9 months. I do believe this on individual level, probably, at least for the moment, is giving us personal alternatives. So this is like every crisis that people go through, but for this time it was collective. It happens to all of us at the same time, and we can talk with each other about it. When people now meet, they're all the time asking themselves what you have been doing all these days, what you have been thinking about, what you have been reading. And of course you can after this believe that it was a kind of a collective hallucination. And to be honest, if they're not going to be more infected than dead people, believe me that in 3 years, 70% of the Austrians are going to believe that it was just a big kind of a manipulation organized by here and there. Conspiracy theories are going to prevail. But even if this is the case, this special, strange experience where we stopped probably is going to stay.
Ivan, thank you very much.
Thank you.